CEO goes undercover as a broke waiter. What he saw will shock you. Before we dive in, tell us, have you ever worked a job where the boss had no idea what it was really like? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking, real-life stories. Maria's shift was supposed to end over an hour ago, yet she was still wiping down the last of the tables while her two little ones were at home with the babysitter, waiting on a dinner she could barely afford. She'd taken this waitressing job because the tips on a good night could get her closer to paying off overdue bills, but something about that evening felt off from the moment she'd clocked in. The first thing she noticed was the new hire, Daniel. He didn't look like the typical new guy. There was a certain calmness in his eyes, almost like he was studying everything around him: the flickering lights, the chipped paint on the walls, the manager Greg barking orders from the corner booth as he casually sipped on a soda he hadn't paid for. Daniel's appearance was unremarkable enough: plain t-shirt, slightly wrinkled pants, but his posture gave him away. He was too upright, too measured. Maria picked up on that instantly, but she tried to keep her head down. After all, she was already 3 hours past the time she was supposed to go home to her kids. She didn't want to start any trouble. A few minutes into the shift, though, trouble walked right up to her when Greg marched over and slapped down her receipt in front of her, accusing her of forgetting to charge a customer for a side dish. Maria tried to defend herself, saying the customer never mentioned an extra side, but Greg's face was turning red. He jabbed a finger at her tips, demanded she hand over a couple of dollars to compensate the restaurant for the alleged mistake. That was her first red flag of the night. Usually Greg's temper didn't flare until something truly major happened, but here he was, practically exploding over the cost of a small side item. Maria reluctantly handed the money over. She needed this job too badly to argue. When Daniel witnessed this exchange, he stepped in and offered to pay out of his own pocket, but Greg shot him a withering glare and told him to stay in his lane. That glare was a second red flag, at least in Maria's eyes. It wasn't just anger in Greg's expression. There was also a flicker of panic, almost as if he didn't want any outside interference in how he handled the staff. Maria had seen that look before, back when another co-worker tried to stand up for her during a confrontation. That co-worker was fired the next day for incompetence, despite being one of the hardest workers on the team. Daniel, however, didn't look rattled at all. He simply nodded, apologized for stepping in, and went back to trying to figure out how to punch in orders on the ancient cash register. The tension didn't leave the air, though. Instead, it hovered around the entire diner like a storm cloud, ready to unleash thunder and lightning at the slightest provocation. Maria watched from the corner of her eye as Daniel fiddled with the buttons, occasionally glancing around to see if Greg was watching. The diner's old fluorescent sign buzzed overhead, the place nearly empty except for a handful of late-night customers. Maria wanted nothing more than to clock out and see her kids, but Greg was sure to find some reason to keep her longer. He always did. Whether it was a spill in the back room or a pile of dishes no one else bothered to tackle, he had a knack for pinning it all on Maria. She tried to remind herself that it was worth it. The job kept the lights on, more or less, and the small paychecks and tips were all that stood between her kids and a cold, dark apartment. Lost in her thoughts, she startled when Daniel approached with an order slip in hand. He had a curious, almost apologetic expression. In a low voice, he asked how long she'd been working at the diner. Maria hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Greg was nowhere in sight, so she murmured back that she'd been here nearly 2 years, despite the conditions. Daniel then asked if she thought management treated the employees fairly. Maria nearly laughed. Treat employees fairly? That was a fantasy in this place. But instead of admitting that, she just gave him a vague nod and said, "As fair as anywhere." "Else?" Then she added, "Look, you might not want to ask too many questions. Greg doesn't like people prying." Daniel gave her a small, understanding nod. He said something about how he wanted to learn the ropes, to understand the job from the ground up. She thought it was an odd choice of words, from the ground up, but she left it at that. It wasn't her business to pry into why he was here or what he hoped to accomplish. She had her own problems to worry about. As the clock ticked closer to closing, Maria's legs ached and her eyes burned from exhaustion. She moved between tables with mechanical efficiency, trying not to let her mind wander to her kids at home. Daniel appeared at her elbow again, this time to ask about the tip jar. He wanted to know how it was supposed to be split and if it got tallied properly. She gave him a weary sigh. "It's usually split by shift, but Greg takes his manager's cut." That's why there's never much left over. Daniel pressed on softly. Does the owner know? Maria shrugged. I doubt it, but even if he did, I'm not sure he'd care. Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly, and Maria felt a flicker of curiosity about who this guy really was. But before she could ask, Greg burst through the kitchen doors, barking at Maria to help Daniel get the soda machine refilled. Another stall tactic, most likely, to keep her from leaving before her shift truly ended. With a resigned sigh, she followed Daniel to the back storage area, grabbing heavy boxes of syrup canisters. As they worked, Daniel asked how many hours she clocked a week. She frowned. Nobody asked that unless they were fishing for specific information. Yet, despite her suspicion, something about his demeanor made her feel a little safe, like she could open up. Too many, she said, nearly dropping one of the canisters. Sometimes I even have to pick up cleaning jobs after this one, just to make ends meet. Daniel didn't judge. He just nodded and said, "That must be exhausting." It was an understatement. She was dead on her feet most days. She wanted to say that and more, but decided it wasn't worth it. Exhausting was right, but complaining about it wouldn't change anything. She'd long since accepted that this was her life. Outside, Greg's voice echoed as he ripped into another server for some trivial mistake. The air in the storage room felt suffocating, and Maria wondered if she should warn Daniel about staying too long at the diner. She remembered how new employees often didn't last the week under Greg's rule, but something told her Daniel was here for a reason, something bigger than just earning a paycheck. Her intuition had never been wrong before, but she pushed the thought aside and kept working, determined to get home to her kids before they fell asleep. Yet deep down, a knot of tension wound tighter in her stomach, as if this night would turn into something she'd never forget. Greg let out a frustrated huff as he slammed the register closed, cursing under his breath at a small discrepancy in the day's total. Maria watched out of the corner of her eye, noticing how Daniel hovered near him, appearing to take mental notes of every move Greg made. She told herself to stay out of it, that she didn't need another reason for Greg to yell at her. But a strange sense of foreboding settled in. She recalled the way Greg had threatened employees in the past, how he twisted reality to pin problems on anyone but himself. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was poking a very angry bear, and it was only a matter of time before Greg lashed out again. Maria just hoped it wouldn't come at too steep a price for either of them. Maria's final table left, around 1:30 a.m. She forced a smile as she thanked them for coming, even though they barely left a tip. Once they were gone, the diner was silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights. Greg declared that the staff could leave once. The floors were mopped, the counters wiped, and the register counted. That would normally be a shared chore, but Greg pointedly told Maria to handle it. She bit her tongue and grabbed the mop. Daniel stepped forward, offering to help, but Greg snarled that a newbie should mind his own business. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every time Daniel so much as moved, Greg's eyes followed him, a wary, suspicious glare. The strangest part was that Daniel never flinched. He calmly went about finishing his assigned tasks, but Maria sensed he was more alert than ever, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to address something larger. She tried to dismiss the thought and focus on cleaning, ignoring the throbbing in her lower back. Somewhere deep down, a tiny spark of curiosity flared. Who was Daniel really? And why was he here, acting more like an investigator than a desperate new hire who needed the job? At last, Maria wrung out the mop and slid it back into the storage closet. Greg stood behind the counter, tapping his foot as if he'd been waiting forever. "You done now?" he snapped. She nodded, not trusting her voice to come out politely. He waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, go home and don't be late tomorrow." Maria tossed her apron on the counter, but as she turned to leave, Greg stopped her. "Wait, tips for the night." He shoved a paltry few dollars toward her, significantly less than what was actually in the jar. She opened her mouth to protest, but caught sight of Greg's cold stare. One look told her that if she fought him on this, she'd pay for it later. So she took the money, nodding silently, bitterness burning the back of her throat. Daniel stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the entire exchange. She thought she saw something flicker in his expression, anger, disappointment, or maybe determination. It wasn't clear. But Maria didn't have the energy to figure it out. She just wanted to get home. As she pushed open the diner's glass door, she sensed that somehow everything was about to change. It was just a matter of time before the quiet tension brewing in that run-down diner exploded into open conflict. Maria woke up the next morning with a knot of dread in her stomach. She'd managed only a few hours of restless sleep before it was time to get her kids ready for school. As she poured cereal into 2 chipped bowls, she mentally calculated how many hours she needed to work to afford groceries for the rest of the week. It seemed impossible to keep going like this, but she had no choice. She plastered on a brave face for her children, who were too young to understand the weight pressing down on her shoulders. After dropping them off, she ran a quick errand to the local discount store, picking up a few household essentials on clearance, then hurried back to the diner for another soul-crushing shift. To her dismay, Greg was already there, arms folded, surveying the handful of customers who'd trickled in for the early lunch rush. His eyes flicked toward Maria as she walked in, and she got the distinct impression that he was looking for a reason to pounce. She offered a curt nod and quickly grabbed her apron, trying to become invisible. But any hope of a quiet day vanished the moment Daniel stepped inside. He seemed different this morning, no longer hesitant or awkward, but quietly confident, as if he'd made up his mind about something important. She expected Greg to snap at him for being 2 minutes late, but to her surprise, Greg said nothing, just stared at him. An uneasy silence settled over the diner, broken only by the clinking of dishes and the faint chatter of customers. Maria could practically feel the electricity in the air, as though something big was about to happen. Daniel approached the register to clock in, but Greg's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What's that in your hand?" Greg demanded. Daniel paused, revealing a small notebook. Maria felt her heart skip a beat. She remembered Daniel scribbling in that same notebook the night before. Greg looked furious, like a man who just realized he'd been under scrutiny. "You know our policy on personal items during work," Greg growled. "Hand it over." Daniel didn't comply. Instead, he calmly said, "This is just for my own notes, sir. I want to make sure I remember everything I'm learning." Greg's eyes narrowed dangerously, and Maria found herself inching away, ready to intervene if things got heated. She'd seen that look on Greg's face before, right before he fired someone for the most trivial offense. Before Greg could force the issue further, the diner's bell chimed, and a small group of customers came in. Instantly, Greg changed his demeanor. He plastered on a fake smile and stepped away from Daniel. Maria let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She handed Daniel a stack of menus, hoping to diffuse the situation by giving him something to do. He offered her a polite smile, gratitude shining in his eyes. She found it odd that he wasn't trembling in fear or outrage after being cornered by Greg. Most new hires either buckled under Greg's intimidation or stormed out in frustration. Daniel did neither. He went about seating the new arrivals with measured politeness, making sure to check on them as they settled. A few minutes later, Greg marched over to Maria, demanding that she fill the salt and pepper shakers at every table. She was about to do so when Daniel appeared at her side again, whispering that she didn't have to do it all alone. He said he'd handle half of them. Greg caught sight of their exchange and barked, "Maria, I told you to do it." The words echoed across the diner, drawing a few curious glances from the customers. Maria swallowed her pride and nodded, ignoring Daniel's offer. She didn't want to poke the hornet's nest. As the day wore on, the tension only grew. Daniel seemed determined to help wherever he could. He jumped behind the counter to help ring up customers. He bussed tables, and he even rushed into the kitchen when he heard the cook shouting about missing ingredients. Greg watched him like a hawk, his expression growing darker with every passing moment. Maria wondered if Greg sensed something about Daniel, something beyond the obvious. There was a moment when Maria caught Daniel scribbling again in his notebook, and she noticed him writing down numbers, the price of menu items, the cost of ingredients, a rough tally of how much the diner likely pulled in each day. When Daniel realized Maria was watching, he quickly shut the notebook and gave her a pointed look, almost warning her to keep quiet. That moment solidified her suspicion. Daniel wasn't just an ordinary new hire. He was gathering information, possibly to report it to someone higher up, maybe the owner. The possibility both excited and terrified her. If Daniel exposed Greg's wrongdoing, it could mean big changes for everyone. But it could also mean losing her job if Greg decided to retaliate. Maria tried to refocus on her tables, but she couldn't help glancing over at Daniel from time to time. He moved through the diner with a confidence that belied his supposed inexperience. He charmed the customers, engaged them in light conversation, and even deftly handled a complaint about cold fries by dashing back to the kitchen and returning with a fresh, steaming basket. When the customer tried to tip him directly for his efforts, Daniel placed the tip in the jar and insisted that all tips should be shared. Greg, who'd been watching from a distance, looked ready to explode. After the lunch rush ended, Daniel disappeared briefly into the back office. Maria's blood ran cold. No one went into the back office without Greg's permission. She braced herself for a confrontation, fully expecting Greg to burst through the door any second, dragging Daniel out by his collar. But after a tense couple of minutes, Daniel emerged, face calm but eyes shining with determination. He slipped the notebook back into his pocket, and Maria swore she heard the faint crinkling of papers, as if Daniel had taken something from Greg's office. She pretended not to notice. When Greg finally noticed that Daniel had vanished and then reappeared, he cornered him by the soda fountain. "You've been gone a while," Greg said accusingly. Daniel just shrugged. "Restroom break." Greg didn't seem satisfied, but he couldn't exactly accuse Daniel of lying without proof. That moment seemed to solidify the growing animosity between them. Maria sensed a showdown looming on the horizon. She wondered if Daniel had any idea how dangerous Greg could be when he felt threatened. It wasn't just about the job. Greg had connections, or so he claimed, and he always boasted that no one could take him down. Whether that was true or not, Maria had no desire to find out the hard way. As the evening crowd began to trickle in, Maria felt exhaustion tugging at every fiber of her being. She'd been on her feet for hours, barely had time to wolf down a small sandwich for lunch, and her second wind was long gone. Still, she had to push through for the dinner rush. That was when the diner made most of its money, and the tips, though often stolen by Greg, were still her best shot at bringing anything extra home. She told herself that maybe tonight she'd earn enough to buy a small treat for her kids. The diner's phone rang around 6 in the evening, and Maria jumped when Greg yelled at her to pick it up. She dried her hands on a towel and answered. The caller was a woman, voice shaking as she asked if there were any job openings. Maria explained that any hiring went through the manager, but as soon as she mentioned Greg, the woman hesitated. Maria tried to be polite, but the woman muttered something about that creep and hung up. Maria didn't have time to dwell on it, because Greg came storming over, demanding to know who was on the phone. She told him it was just someone asking about a job, but Greg's face twisted. "She better not come sniffing around here," he snapped, then stomped off. Maria's mind raced. Could this be the young waitress Greg had harassed before? The one he'd fired on the spot? She remembered how the poor girl left in tears, and it broke her heart to think she might be in a worse situation now. She glanced at Daniel, who was busy clearing a table. He looked up and met her gaze. There was a subtle question in his eyes, as if asking if she was okay. Maria gave a tiny nod, then quickly turned away, feeling that weird flutter of hope again. Maybe Daniel was here to fix things. Maybe he was the catalyst they all needed to break free from Greg's tyranny, but she also knew that such hope could be dangerous. People like Greg always found a way to land on their feet. The dinner rush hit with full force soon after that. Customers packed the booths, orders came flying in, and the kitchen staff scrambled to keep up. Greg alternated between yelling at the cooks, berating the servers, and stuffing his face with food he didn't pay for. Maria ran back and forth with plates balanced on her arms, sweat trickling down her forehead. She noticed Daniel was holding his own, calmly navigating the chaos. He helped take orders, delivered dishes, and even refilled drinks without needing to be asked. Everything about his performance screamed competence, which was highly unusual for a newbie. She'd seen new, highest crack under this kind of pressure, yet Daniel seemed to thrive in it, as though he was used to stress at a much higher level. At one point, a customer complained that their steak was undercooked. Greg, noticing that Daniel had taken the order, demanded that Daniel pay for the replacement out of his tips. Daniel stiffened but didn't argue, and Maria felt a flare of anger on his behalf. She knew Greg's tactic: make employees think it's their fault so he could justify pocketing any extra money. But Daniel surprised her by calmly stating that he would take care of the replacement himself. He disappeared into the kitchen and re-emerged a few minutes later, personally delivering a perfectly cooked steak to the table. The customer was pleased, but Greg fumed. "You think you're some kind of hero," he muttered as Daniel walked past him. Daniel just shook his head, expression unreadable. By the time the dinner rush began to wind down, Maria's feet were throbbing, and her uniform was stained with grease and soda. She collected the final round of tips before glancing at the clock. It was almost 9. Her kids would be missing. Her and the babysitter would need to head home soon. She approached Greg, mustering the courage to ask if she could leave. Immediately, he refused. "I need you to wipe down every single chair and table," he barked. "And don't think you can slip out early just because we're not busy." She bit back a retort, fully aware that arguing would only make him dig his heels in more. Daniel, however, quietly said, "I can help with that." Greg rounded on him. "Did I ask for your help? Mind your own business, rookie." Daniel glanced at Maria, and she could see the indignation in his eyes, but he stayed silent. They both knew how this played out. As the minutes ticked by, the diner emptied until it was just the employees left. Greg occupied one corner booth, counting the day's take and stuffing small bills into his own pocket. The night cook offered Maria a sympathetic shrug before clocking out. She was alone with Daniel and Greg, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maria methodically wiped each table, her body screaming in protest, but she refused to give Greg the satisfaction of complaining. Daniel finished wiping the counters, then walked over to Maria, offering to take the rag from her. She opened her mouth to say yes. Her arms felt like lead, but Greg barked from his booth, "Daniel, get over here." Daniel hesitated, then walked over. Greg pointed at his open ledger, an outdated record of the diner's finances. "What do you make of this?" Greg asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Daniel glanced at the numbers, then said something Maria couldn't quite hear. Greg's face grew dark, and he slammed the ledger shut. "You're not as slick as you think," he spat. "I see you snooping around, writing in that little book of yours." Daniel remained calm. "I'm just learning how the business runs," he replied. "Evenly." Greg let out a mirthless laugh. "Sure you are. But you better watch yourself, or you'll be out of a job just as fast as you got one." Maria paused her cleaning, a knot forming in her stomach. This was it, the moment she feared. Greg was onto Daniel, and if she knew Greg, he wouldn't hesitate to unleash real consequences. She prayed silently that Daniel would back down, at least until tomorrow when they were both out of Greg's line of fire. But then Daniel did something Maria couldn't have predicted. He snapped his notebook out of his pocket and flipped it open in front of Greg. "You're right," Daniel said, voice steady. "I've been taking notes. The question is, why? Do you have a problem with that?" Greg stared at Daniel in disbelief, struggling to form a retort. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. This kind of open defiance was practically a death sentence at this diner. She half expected Greg to fire Daniel on the spot. Instead, Greg let out a bark of laughter that was anything but friendly. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But you've picked the wrong place to play detective." Daniel gave a small smile. "I'm not playing anything," he said. "I'm just trying to understand how things work around here." Greg's jaw tightened. Maria could see the rage simmering behind his eyes. He liked to maintain the illusion that he was untouchable. Anyone who challenged that was a direct threat. She took a cautious step closer, ready to intervene if things got physical. Greg finally sneered and snatched the notebook from Daniel's hand. "Let's see what's so important," he growled, flipping through the pages. Maria saw lines of neat handwriting, columns of numbers, and notes about employee schedules, tip distributions, and even an entry about the missing wages from last night. Greg's face twisted as he read. "This is nonsense," he spat. "You think you're going to show this to someone, get me in trouble?" Daniel calmly reached for the notebook, but Greg yanked it away. "Don't hold your breath," Greg continued. "The owner doesn't care. He doesn't care about you or her," he jerked his chin at Maria, "or anyone else here. This place is a cash cow and I run it my way." Maria felt a chill at the venom in Greg's voice. It was the same line he used whenever someone hinted at going over his head. The owner doesn't care. She used to believe it was true that as long as the diner turned a profit, no one higher up would question Greg's methods. But then again, she'd never met the owner. None of them had. Daniel exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Interesting," he said quietly, "because I've heard differently." Greg slapped the notebook against the table, leaning forward so close to Daniel that their noses nearly touched. "And where'd you hear that? You got a direct line to the big boss?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Maybe," Greg snorted. "You think you're tough, but you're just another minimum wage grunt. Guys like me, we decide who stays and who goes. You're walking a real thin line here, buddy." Maria couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped between them, heart hammering. "Greg, that's enough. He hasn't done anything wrong." Greg turned his glare on her. "You want to be next? Because I can make that happen. Your shifts. Your paycheck, I control all of it." He waved the notebook in front of her face. "You're lucky I let you stay as long as I have, especially with your personal baggage." Maria felt her cheeks flame with humiliation. She knew exactly what he meant by personal baggage. Her kids, her financial struggles. Greg had a habit of using people's vulnerabilities against them. Yet despite the shame burning in her stomach, she squared her shoulders. "That's not fair," she managed to say, voice shaking but determined. "We work hard, and you know it." Greg scoffed. "Hard work? You think I can't find 10 more desperate single moms to replace you in a heartbeat?" Daniel placed a gentle hand on Maria's arm, signaling for her to stand aside. She hesitated, but the intensity in his eyes made her take a step back. Daniel turned to Greg, voice dropping to a near whisper. "You really think you're untouchable?" Greg's laughter was harsh and mocking. "At this diner? Yeah, I do." Daniel reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small slip of paper, holding it out. Greg glanced at it suspiciously. "What's that?" Daniel's voice hardened. "Proof that employees here have been getting shorted on wages. It's an employee roster and payroll schedule from your office. I found it lying around." Greg's face paled slightly, but he covered it with a sneer. "So what? It's just numbers on a page. Nobody's going to care." Maria's eyes darted to the slip of paper. It was a spreadsheet listing names, hours worked and actual pay disbursed. The discrepancies were glaring. The hours worked never matched the pay employees received. She recognized her own name on the list, and her stomach twisted in anger and betrayal. She'd suspected Greg of pocketing wages, but she never had concrete proof. Now there it was, right in front of her. Greg shook his head, chuckling darkly. "Even if that's real, you can't touch me. The owner won't do squat." Daniel calmly returned the paper to his pocket. "We'll see." With that, he turned to Maria, quietly asking if she was done with her tasks. She nodded, blinking back the sting of tears. Greg watched them with a mix of fury and disbelief, as though he couldn't believe Daniel had the audacity to stand up to him and walk away. For a moment, Maria thought Greg might physically attack Daniel right then and there, but he just stood there, fists clenched, eyes burning with hate. As Maria gathered her things, she wondered if Daniel had just signed his own termination notice, or worse. She also wondered if Greg might come after her next. Still, a tiny spark of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe Daniel had the power to change things. Maybe he was the lifeline she'd been waiting for. But as she slipped out into the cool night air, she realized the danger that now surrounded them both. If Greg felt cornered, he'd do anything to maintain his grip on the diner. Maria hugged herself against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, and hurried home, silently hoping she wouldn't regret the stand she'd just taken. Maria arrived the next day feeling tense and apprehensive. She barely slept again. her thoughts consumed by the possibility of losing her job, or worse, seeing Daniel get fired and all hope for change dashed. She didn't see Greg at first, which offered a small reprieve. She put on her apron and went straight to work, seating the early customers who trickled in for breakfast. Half an hour later, Daniel showed up, and if he felt any fear from last night's confrontation, he didn't show it. He greeted Maria with a polite nod, then started his tasks. For a while everything was quiet, almost eerily so. Greg was nowhere to be found, which was unusual for a manager who liked to loom over every move. The cook speculated that maybe Greg was sick, but Maria doubted it. She had a feeling he was scheming something. That feeling intensified when, around mid-morning, Greg finally walked in. He wore a smug expression, and he was accompanied by a man Maria had never seen before, a man in a sharp suit carrying a briefcase. The two of them made a beeline for the back office. Maria and Daniel exchanged worried glances, suspecting that this newcomer was some kind of enforcer or corporate ally who would help Greg clamp down on any dissent. The lunch rush came and went, and still Greg and the stranger remained in the office. Occasionally, Maria heard raised voices through the thin door, but she couldn't make out any words. Daniel waited on tables with his usual calm efficiency, but she noticed his eyes frequently drifting toward the back. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, the office door flew open and Greg stomped out, looking enraged. The suited man followed, grim-faced, glancing at Daniel with an unreadable expression. Greg pointed at Daniel. "You, come here," he barked. Customers looked up curiously, and Maria's pulse raced. She set down the plates she was carrying and hurried after Daniel, not sure if he'd need backup. Standing in the middle of the diner, Greg folded his arms and glared. "My associate here is from corporate," he announced loudly so everyone could hear. "He's heard some ridiculous claims about how this place is being run, so we're going to straighten this out right now." Daniel's expression remained neutral, but Maria could see his jaw clench slightly. The suited man cleared his throat. "I'm here to conduct a small investigation," he said. "We received a tip from an employee, someone who claims there have been wage theft, harassment, and other violations at this location." A hush fell over the diner. Some customers pretended not to listen, but their curiosity was evident. Maria gripped the edge of a nearby table, her heart hammering. This was it. If corporate took Greg's side, and they likely would, Daniel could end up jobless, and she might too. Greg sneered. "Yeah, well, that employee is a liar, and I'm sure this so-called proof of his is just a misunderstanding." Daniel finally spoke up. "No misunderstanding," he said quietly. Greg barked a laugh. "Oh? So you think you're going to show this man your little notebook, and he'll believe everything you say?" He looked at the corporate man. "Sir, I've run this diner successfully for years. We've had no complaints until this clown showed up. He's been snooping around, stirring up trouble. I doubt he even has any real evidence." Daniel reached into his pocket, but before he could pull anything out, Greg lunged. In a split second, Greg snatched the notebook away. Daniel tried to grab it back, but Greg shoved him aside, then waved the notebook in the air. "You think this proves anything?" Greg snarled. He opened it to a random page, scanning the notes, smirking. But as the corporate man looked on, Daniel quietly straightened his uniform and said, "You should probably give that back." Greg ripped a page out of the notebook, crumpling it. "Or what?" Daniel's voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it. "Or you'll be in violation of corporate policy regarding the destruction of evidence." Greg froze, a puzzled frown crossing his face. "What the hell are you talking about?" A sudden hush fell as the corporate man stared at Daniel with a sharp, assessing gaze. Maria realized something monumental was about to happen. Daniel squared his shoulders. "I'm not just a new hire," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm the owner's son. I've been evaluating the management here, undercover." A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Maria felt her heart practically leap out of her chest. It was even bigger than she'd imagined. Not just an employee from corporate, but the owner's son himself. Greg's face went slack with shock, then quickly twisted in fury. "That's impossible," he hissed. But the corporate man quietly confirmed it, nodding. "He is. I was sent here because we've had some concerning reports, and we needed to verify them." Greg's eyes darted around, searching for a lifeline. The customers were openly staring now, a few of them even filming on their phones. Maria swallowed hard, a strange mix of relief and terror flooding her. On one hand, this could mean the end of Greg's reign of terror. On the other hand, the fallout could be tremendous. Daniel stepped closer to Greg, holding out his hand. "My notebook," he demanded softly. Greg, still reeling from the revelation, shoved the notebook at him with trembling hands. "This place runs fine," he tried to bluster. I do everything by the book." Daniel shook his head. "No, you don't. We have payroll discrepancies, tip theft, harassment, and if what I've personally witnessed over the last few days is any indication, you've been abusing your staff for a long time." Maria watched Greg's face crumble, replaced by fury. She sensed he might try something desperate to save himself, but the corporate man stepped forward, placing a hand on Greg's shoulder. "We'll be conducting a full investigation, effective immediately." He turned to Daniel. "Should I have security escort him out?" Daniel's gaze locked onto Greg. "I want him to stay here for now," he said, voice calm but firm. "I need to make sure everyone hears what's going to happen next, and I want him to witness it." Greg growled something unintelligible, but he didn't resist. The corporate man cleared his throat, motioning for everyone, staff and curious customers alike, to listen. He explained that there would be an audit, that they'd be interviewing employees, reviewing payroll records, and anything else to determine the extent of Greg's misconduct. Maria felt a weight lift off her shoulders, as though the nightmare might finally end, but at the same time she felt a jolt of fear. Would her testimony be enough? Would she face retaliation once Daniel left? Daniel glanced at Maria, then at the few remaining staff members who had gathered. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "I know this must be a shock, but change is coming." Greg stood there, quivering with rage. "You set me up," he whispered, pointing a shaking finger at Daniel. "You'll regret this." Daniel didn't flinch. He just tucked the notebook back into his pocket. "We'll see," he replied. Then he turned to Maria. "Thank you for your hard work," he said softly. She stared at him, stunned. For so long she'd felt powerless, barely surviving from shift to shift. Now, in a matter of moments, the entire power dynamic had shifted. But she also knew the fight wasn't over. Greg wasn't the type to go quietly, and the corporate man had only begun his investigation. She braced herself for what came next, determined to make sure the truth was laid bare, no matter how terrifying it might be. The corporate investigation moved faster than Maria expected. Over the following hours, employees were individually called into the back office to give their statements. The cook recounted the times Greg underordered supplies so he could pocket the difference, forcing them to serve subpar meals. A waitress tearfully revealed the harassment she'd endured, detailing how Greg threatened to fire her if she didn't go out with him after work. Maria tried to steady her nerves when it was her turn, detailing the missing wages, the stolen tips, and the constant hostility that made each shift feel like walking on eggshells. The corporate man, whose name was Mr. Carlson, listened intently, taking notes on a laptop. Daniel wasn't in the room during the interviews, apparently wanting to minimize any sense of intimidation. Still, Maria felt a trembling sense of relief as she finally voiced the truth she'd been too scared to say out loud. Afterward, she returned to the dining area, where a subdued hush had replaced the usual buzz of plates and conversation. Greg sat in a corner booth, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who dared glance in his direction. Some of the regular customers had left, sensing the tension was too thick to enjoy a meal. Others lingered out of curiosity, hoping to see more drama unfold. When Daniel finally emerged from the kitchen, a group of employees surrounded him, peppering him with questions. Why hadn't he revealed his identity earlier? Was he really the owner's son, or was that just a corporate cover story? What would happen to Greg? Daniel answered calmly and patiently, explaining that his father, the company's founder, wanted an unfiltered look at how some of their locations were actually being run. He confessed that he'd been shocked by the extent of the abuse he'd witnessed here. As the employees listened, some looked hopeful, others wary. Maria joined them, crossing her arms as she studied Daniel's face. There was sincerity there, a genuine concern that she hadn't seen in many authority figures. She realized she wanted to trust him, to believe that after all this suffering, real change was possible. But she couldn't shake a nagging doubt. There had been rumors for years that the owner was aware of how Greg operated and did nothing because the diner still turned a profit. Could Daniel really reverse all that? She kept those doubts to herself. After all, Daniel had already shown more integrity than Greg ever had. Eventually, the time came for the confrontation everyone knew was inevitable. Mr. Carlson stepped out of the office carrying a folder stuffed with papers. He approached Greg's booth, accompanied by Daniel, and followed by nearly every employee. On duty. Greg stood up, face like thunder, as Mr. Carlson began to list the violations in a formal tone. Unpaid overtime, skimming tips, harassment, falsification of records. The list went on. The color drained from Greg's face, replaced by a furious red flush as he realized how deep the trouble ran. When Mr. Carlson finished, Daniel took a step forward, keeping his voice low but audible to everyone. "We trusted you to manage this location fairly," he said. "You've betrayed that trust and hurt the people who keep this place running. There will be consequences." Greg banged his fist on the table, rattling the salt and pepper shakers. "You can't do this to me. I've been here for years. I'm the reason this dump even makes money." Daniel's expression hardened. "We can and we will. Effective immediately, you're suspended from your managerial duties pending a final decision from the company's board." Greg let out a harsh laugh. "Suspended? Don't sugarcoat it, rich boy. You're trying to fire me, aren't you?" Daniel paused, then nodded. "Yes, if the allegations are confirmed, that's exactly what will happen." A tense silence followed, everyone's eyes fixed on Greg, waiting to see if he'd lash out or back down. Maria felt her heart thudding in her chest. She half expected Greg to turn violent, to start shouting obscenities or throw a punch. Instead, he abruptly scooped up his personal items from the booth and glowered at everyone. "You'll regret this," he whispered, voice shaking with rage. "I promise you that." He stormed out of the diner, the bell on the door jangling frantically behind him. A stunned hush filled the air. The employees looked around at each other, unsure whether to celebrate or brace for aftershocks. Daniel exhaled, turning to Mr. Carlson. "Have you compiled enough evidence to proceed with the next steps?" Mr. Carlson nodded. "Yes. We'll finalize our findings and report to the board. In the meantime, we need someone to manage this place while we assess the damage." All eyes turned to Daniel, who shook his head. "I'm still in the middle of my overall evaluation of the company's other locations. I won't be here full-time." He paused, scanning the faces of the employees, many of whom still looked frightened. His gaze landed on Maria. She blinked, heart quickening as she realized what he was about to propose. "Maria," Daniel said softly, "you've been here longer than almost anyone else. You know how things should run, and I've seen how you treat customers and co-workers. Would you be willing to step in, at least temporarily?" Maria's mouth went dry. She felt the eyes of her co-workers on her, and she felt a surge of panic mixed with a strange, exhilarating sense of possibility. She'd never dreamed of being in charge, but she also knew this diner and its people better than anyone. If anyone could steer it away from Greg's toxic legacy, maybe it was her. After a long moment, she nodded, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I'll do it, but I can't promise I'll be perfect." Daniel offered a reassuring smile. "No one's asking for perfect, just fairness and respect." With that, the tension broke a little. A few employees began to clap hesitantly, and the relief in the air was palpable. Maria felt tears prick her eyes. For so long she'd scraped by, hiding her struggles, enduring mistreatment to keep her job. Now she stood at the threshold of a new beginning, one that could finally lift some of the weight off her shoulders. She couldn't wait to tell her kids that maybe, just maybe, things were about to get better. 2 days after Greg's suspension, the diner felt like a different place. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a great deal of paperwork and reorganization to manage, but the sense of fear that had hung over every shift was gone. Employees smiled more, customers noticed the change in atmosphere, and Maria found herself waking up with a cautious optimism instead of a knot of dread in her stomach. She was adjusting to her new managerial role, making sure everyone clocked their hours properly and ensuring that tips were split fairly. It felt surreal to be the one people looked to for answers, but she tried to remember Daniel's words: fairness and respect. As she walked through the diner that afternoon, checking on tables, she caught sight of Daniel seated in a booth. He'd been dropping by occasionally to monitor the transition, always discreet, never throwing his weight around. She approached, him smoothing her apron. "How's everything today?" she asked. He looked up from a report he was reading and offered a small smile. "I think we're moving in the right direction," he said, nodding approvingly at the staff. "And you seem more confident." Maria shrugged, a shy grin tugging at her lips. "I guess I'm still getting used to the idea that I'm not just a waitress anymore." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This came from corporate. It's for you." Maria hesitated, then opened it, finding a check for back pay, money she was owed from all the shifts Greg had underpaid her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized this was enough to cover overdue rent, maybe even pay off some bills that had been piling up. She looked up at Daniel, words failing her. "Thank you," she finally managed. He shook his head. "No thanks needed. That's what you earned. And there will be more coming. We're still going through records to make sure every employee gets what they're owed." Maria felt a weight lifting off her shoulders that she'd carried for so long. Before she could say anything else, the diner's door swung open, and she recognized one of the cooks from the early shift who'd gone home sick. But the cook looked agitated, glancing around nervously. Maria left Daniel to check on him, leading him aside near the kitchen. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked. The cook lowered his voice, eyes darting around. "I saw Greg outside, parked across the street. He's just sitting in his car watching the place." Maria's stomach clenched. She remembered Greg's parting words, the threat in his voice. She glanced at Daniel, who was too far to overhear, then back at the cook. "Try not to worry about it," she said, though her heart pounded. "If he comes in, let me handle it." The cook nodded, looking only slightly reassured. Maria waited a few minutes, pretending to be absorbed in work, then snuck a glance out the front window. Sure enough, there was Greg's car idling in the parking lot across the street. She couldn't see his face through the tinted windows, but she could feel his anger. A small part of her wanted to confront him immediately, to demand to know why he was lurking. But she reminded herself that she had a responsibility to keep this place running smoothly. Picking a public fight wasn't going to help anyone. She returned to Daniel's booth, keeping her tone low. "Greg's outside watching." Daniel's jaw tensed, but he nodded. "Let's see if he does anything," he said softly. "We have security footage in place, and Mr. Carlson has already filed a report. If Greg tries to cause trouble, we'll have evidence." Maria swallowed hard, recalling how unpredictable Greg could be, but she trusted Daniel's calm approach. The afternoon wore on, and Greg's car eventually disappeared. Maria tried to push it out of her mind, focusing on the tasks at hand. By the time closing rolled around, she felt a sense of accomplishment as she double-checked the registers, ensuring everything balanced out. The staff exchanged tired smiles, congratulating each other on getting through another day without Greg's tyranny. As Maria locked up, she saw Daniel waiting for her by the door. He offered to walk her to her car, and she accepted, grateful for the companionship. The night air was cool and quiet, the neon diner sign reflecting off puddles in the parking lot. She breathed in the fresh air, relief washing over her. She was about to thank Daniel again for everything he'd done when the roar of an engine made them both turn. Greg's car screeched to a halt a few feet away, headlights glaring. Maria's heart lurched. She instinctively stepped back, closer to Daniel. The car door swung open and Greg emerged, face contorted in anger. He marched toward them, jabbing a finger at Daniel. "You had no right," he spat. "No damn right to humiliate me like that." Maria tensed, memories of his outbursts flooding back. Daniel remained poised, hands at his sides, not backing down. "How you humiliated yourself," Daniel said calmly. Greg's lips curled. "This whole thing was a setup from the start. You come waltzing in, acting like some clueless newbie, just to make me look bad. I've put years into this place, and you—" Daniel cut him off. "You abused your power for years. The only person responsible for that is you." Greg's fist clenched, and for a split second, Maria feared he might throw a punch. But then he seemed to remember they were in a lit parking lot, presumably with cameras and potential witnesses. He let out a frustrated hiss. "You think you can just ruin my life and walk away? You'll see," he snarled. "This isn't over." Maria found her voice. "Greg, you did this to yourself. I'm sorry, but we're done living under your rule." Greg's eyes flicked to her, and a twisted smile crossed his face. "You're just a waitress who got lucky. Don't think this promotion means you're anyone special." Maria felt a flash of hurt, but she stood her ground. "I'm doing my best to fix what you broke," she said quietly. "I won't apologize for that." Greg threw his hands up in disgust, then stormed back to his car. He peeled out of the parking lot with a screech, leaving them in a swirl of exhaust fumes and tension. Maria's hands were shaking, but she felt oddly relieved. He'd made a scene. He'd tried to intimidate them, and it didn't work. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" She took a deep breath, nodding. "Yes, I'm okay." And in that moment she realized it was true. For the first time in a long while she actually felt safe, or at least safer. Greg's threats were still scary, but he no longer held the power he once did. A week later, life at the diner began to settle into a new normal. Maria took to her managerial role with determination and a renewed sense of purpose. She ensured every worker got their rightful share of tips, posted clear schedules, and even found ways to improve the workflow. Customers noticed the positive shift, and some even complimented the improved service. Daniel dropped by occasionally, offering support and feedback. His presence always reminded Maria of how drastically her life had changed in such a short span of time. One afternoon, after the lunch rush, Daniel invited Maria to join him at a booth to discuss a possible future for the diner. She slid in, across from him, nervously twisting a napkin in her hands. "So," he began, "Mr. Carlson and I have reviewed the initial findings. Greg's definitely not coming back. The board is likely to fire him once all the paperwork is done." Maria nodded, relieved to have confirmation. "What does that mean for this place?" Daniel leaned forward, earnest. "It means we need a permanent manager, someone who understands the employees, respects them, and knows how to keep customers happy. I want that person to be you." Her eyes widened. She'd been prepared for a temporary role, not a permanent one. "But I barely got a handle on this. I'm not sure I can do it forever." Daniel smiled. "You're already doing it. Sure. There's a learning curve and you'll need some training. But I've seen what you can do when you're given the chance. You've kept this place afloat during an intense transition. The staff trusts you." She glanced around the diner, seeing co-workers bustling happily, no longer flinching every time the manager walked by. She thought of her 2 kids at home, how she could finally afford a decent babysitter without feeling guilty, and maybe even pay for better school supplies. A wave of gratitude washed over her. I'd love to," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you." Daniel leaned back, relief evident in his eyes. "Great. We'll handle the formalities soon. As for pay, we'll make sure you're compensated fairly." Maria almost didn't want to ask what fairly meant, afraid it might be less than she hoped. But Daniel read the question on her face and said, "It'll be significantly more than what you've been making. You'll finally have time for your kids too. No more double shifts or cleaning jobs." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to cry in front of a near stranger, even if that stranger was, in fact, the owner's son who had turned her life around. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "You earned this." They spent the next hour going over details, from staffing to inventory to potential promotions for other hard-working employees. Maria felt her excitement growing. It was more responsibility than she'd ever taken on, but she felt a renewed energy to make the diner a place she could be proud of, a place that supported the people who gave so much of themselves to keep the doors open. When the conversation wrapped up, Daniel stood to leave. Maria walked him to the door, the sunlight streaming in as the afternoon wore on. A handful of regulars waved goodbye to him, clearly having warmed up to the polite, unassuming man they now knew was actually the big boss's son. Before stepping outside, Daniel paused, turning to Maria. "You know, I meant what I said about checking in regularly, undercover," he said with a teasing smile. "Gotta keep you on your toes." Maria laughed softly, a sense of camaraderie replacing the initial wariness she'd felt towards him. "I'll be ready," she replied. He nodded, then disappeared into the bright day, leaving Maria with a sense of triumph she could barely contain. As the evening approached, Maria finished her shift without dread. She even managed to leave at a reasonable hour, heading home to make dinner for her kids. She stopped by a grocery store on the way, picking out fresh vegetables, a small roast, and even some ice cream for dessert, a luxury she could never have afforded before. When she unlocked her apartment door, her children rushed to greet her, their eyes lighting up when they saw the bags of food. "Mommy, did we win the lottery?" her youngest asked, wide-eyed at the sight of real dinner ingredients instead of the usual instant noodles or canned soup. Maria knelt down, hugging them both tight, tears threatening to spill over. "Something like that," she murmured, ruffling her daughter's hair. She couldn't explain in detail how everything changed. Not yet, but the hope in her heart was undeniable. That night, as she tucked them into bed after a real home-cooked meal, she felt lighter than she had in years. Later, when the apartment was quiet and her children slept peacefully, Maria reflected on the events that had led her to this point. She remembered that moment she first spotted Daniel, sensing something off about him. She recalled the terror she felt whenever Greg snapped at her, threatened her job, or stole her wages. And she remembered the overwhelming sense of relief when Daniel revealed who he really was. Through all of it, she had clung to her dignity, refusing to completely break under Greg's tyranny. Now she had a chance to build a better life for herself and her kids, and to create a supportive environment for the employees who relied on the diner for their livelihood. She vowed not to squander this opportunity. She knew Greg might still be out there, nursing his anger, looking for a way to strike back. But with Daniel and corporate backing her, she felt safer than ever, and more importantly, she felt that she deserved this position, that it wasn't some lucky fluke. She had earned her place, and no amount of lurking from Greg could take that away. As Maria finally allowed herself to relax and drift off to sleep, she held on to the certainty that tomorrow would be better. And for once, that certainty felt real, not just another empty promise in a long line of disappointments. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of training sessions, meetings with corporate, and phone calls with other managers in the restaurant chain who offered advice on best practices. Maria embraced the learning curve, spending her free hours reading up on management tips, conflict resolution, and even basic accounting so she could understand the financial side of running a diner. Daniel introduced her to some of the higher-ups in the company, and she was surprised at how welcoming they were. It turned out that Greg's toxic methods weren't the norm for the chain. He was just an outlier who'd slipped through the cracks because his numbers looked good on paper. The day the board officially terminated, Greg was one Maria would never forget. She received a call from Mr. Carlson, who congratulated her on her new role as permanent manager and assured her that the company would support her if Greg ever tried to retaliate. Although Greg hadn't been seen for a while, Maria still felt a flicker of anxiety whenever she spotted a similar-looking car drive past the diner. But her fears eased with each passing day, and soon she barely thought about him at all. Under Maria's leadership, the diner thrived. Staff morale rose and word spread among customers that the place had turned over a new leaf. Sales gradually increased, and corporate took notice. They even sent a small bonus to the employees for outstanding performance, something Greg would never have allowed. Daniel continued his undercover visits, though he wasn't very good at staying incognito anymore. Everyone recognized him, and they joked that he was the world's worst spy. But the light-hearted atmosphere was a welcome change from the terror that once gripped the place. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, Maria found a moment to sit in one of the booths and reflect. She sipped a cup of coffee, letting her gaze drift over the place that had once felt like a prison. Now it felt like home, a place where she could provide for her family without shame or fear. She thought about the night Daniel first showed up, how she'd pegged him as someone far too polished to be a simple new hire. She smiled ruefully at how her instincts were proven right in the most dramatic way possible. As she took another sip of coffee, she felt her phone buzz in her pocket. It was a text from Daniel, letting her know he'd be dropping by in a couple of days to check on some new equipment proposals she'd submitted. She texted back a quick, "Thanks, see you then," and put the phone away, feeling a warm glow. Of contentment. It wasn't just about the improved paycheck or the sense of authority. It was about the respect she finally commanded, both for herself and for the co-workers she cared about. She was determined that none of them would ever have to suffer under someone like Greg again. Moments later, the door to the diner opened and a young mother walked in, 2 small children in tow. Maria watched as the woman hesitantly approached the counter, asking if they could share a single meal. The sight reminded Maria of her own struggles, of how she used to scrape by just to give her kids a semblance of a good life. Without hesitation, Maria rose and approached them with a friendly smile. "Have a seat," she said. "Dinner's on us tonight." The woman looked shocked and began to protest, but Maria insisted. She recognized that haunted, desperate look in the mother's eyes, and she remembered how a small act of kindness could mean the world to someone at rock bottom. She signaled to one of the servers to bring out a hearty meal, including milk for the kids. The woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, and Maria felt her own heart swell. When she returned to her booth, she realized she'd come full circle. She was no longer just a waitress scraping by. She was a manager who had the power to make choices that could uplift others. It wasn't about charity or pity. It was about compassion, something the diner had sorely lacked under Greg's rule. She thought of her children at home, safe and sleeping soundly. And she made a promise to herself. She would run this diner in a way that honored the people who put their heart and soul into every shift. She would be the kind of leader she wished she'd had from the start. And if Daniel ever went undercover again, he'd find a place run not by fear but by mutual respect and genuine care. Yes, there would still be challenges. Yes, Greg might harbor resentment, and trouble could surface in the future. But for now, Maria allowed herself to savor the moment. A moment of peace, triumph, and undeniable hope. It was a feeling that lingered long after she locked up the diner for the night, stepping out into the cool air with a heart that felt finally, blessedly, light.